Welcome to another Good Decision. My name is Daniel Popovsky, Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Governance Institute of Australia. Today we're talking sustainability, and with us we have a very special guest, Måns Carlsson-Sweeny. He's Head of ESG and Co-Portfolio Manager at Ausbil Investment Management Limited. From embedding ESG into strategy to turning challenges into opportunities, Måns shares with us how good decisions today can lead to lasting impact tomorrow. Måns, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I wanted to kick off the first question on climate-related financial disclosures. We have some of the largest corporate entities in Australia now reporting under the scheme, and we have small entities on stream up to about 2028. What can you tell us about the opportunities and challenges of the new climate-related financial disclosure framework at the moment, and how that's all panning out over the next year?
Thank you for having me. I mean, it's a very multi-faceted issue, climate change, and I think you're right in saying risks and opportunities, because that's how I see it. If I start with the opportunity side first, I think businesses need to understand how climate change affects them. And one aspect I really like about the TCFD standard, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is that rather than having a crystal ball forecasting out what's going to happen between now and 2050, it does allow companies to do a scenario analysis, and now that's mandated. And I think that aspect is really good, because a world in a 1.5 degree warming world versus a 3 degree world is very different. And I think there lies the opportunity for companies then to understand how will we be impacted. And from investors like ourselves, that's exactly how we see it. So we've been doing an internal climate change scenario analysis for 6 years now, where we look at, in this 1.5 degree world, we've had rapid decarbonisation, probably a very high price on carbon. Which sectors and which companies will be impacted by that? But then you also have the physical climate change risk as well. And if I'm on a corporate side, it's hard to predict those things between now and 2050. So having a scenario analysis, I think it makes perfect sense. So therein lies the opportunity, I think. And you're almost stress testing the business resilience under different scenarios. On the challenge side, I would say, first of all, the data. So emissions data, for instance, if that's sourced from a third party, you need to ascertain the quality of that data, the reliability, and in my experience, there have been a few issues with that. You also want to avoid double counting, for instance. And because it's a mandatory reporting regime, well, there's also governance aspects of that, which is if you're on a board and you sign off on that, you need to know that you can sign off on something that's trustworthy. And that also goes for the forward-looking nature of the scenario analysis. Fortunately, there's not a surprise that we're going down this path. Many other jurisdictions have started to introduce climate change reporting. The TCFD standard I mentioned before, it's been around for a long time. So many companies have done this on a voluntary basis. So hopefully for those companies, I think it'll be fairly frictionless. But it comes down to smaller things like getting assurance on the data itself and making sure that what you present does not have those data quality issues, and that you can also have assurance on it.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I think also Group 3 entities now coming on stream in the near future. I believe that's 2028 where they will need to be reporting. What can they do now, I guess, to prepare? You touched a bit on the issue around data being a bit of a hurdle, assurance also being a bit of a hurdle as well. How can those group entities that perhaps don't have the resources or capacity enable themselves to start reporting early up until 2028?
As investors, we take ESG into account because we want to make better informed investment decisions, and there's a wide range of ESG issues. The risk I see here is that companies only get focused on climate change at the expense of other issues. My advice to companies would be to start now. The earlier you start, the better. You don't want to sit there that same year that is mandatory for you and then face all the data quality concerns and challenges. And to some extent, I think many of the Group 3 companies would be involved somewhere along the value chain either way. So they might have customers that need to report on their emissions, and therefore they become part of a Scope 3. So I think the general advice is just to get started now and plan for resourcing. I think it shouldn't be underestimated how resource intensive it is to do this mandatory reporting, because there's governance ramifications around that too. If you do source third-party data on emissions, for instance, well, just do due diligence on different providers and make sure you get the one where you can verify the data and you're comfortable with the data. That will be my general advice now.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And also, we've noticed over the past couple of years, ASIC has now really stepped up its game in terms of compliance and enforcement of greenwashing and all the issues that come out with data and, the actual facts in the reports that come out through sustainability reporting. What are your views on regulatory hurdles for greenwashing, and how is that playing out in the real world in terms of what can companies think of in ways to avoid greenwashing when reporting sustainability reporting?
Yes, I'll give you my layman's view because I'm not a lawyer, but I would say this in its simplest form. The whole greenwashing exercise comes back to one simple fact, and it's about do what you say you do. It's really that simple in principle. In practice, of course, you need to be very careful with your language, but ultimately that's what it comes down to. So if you oversell your sustainability credentials without backing it up, well, you might face problems. But as long as you report on what you do in a concise and factual manner, I don't think companies have anything to be concerned about. Where it gets a bit grey, and I think it's challenging, is when you have certain frameworks, like, for instance, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So UN Sustainable Development Goals are 17 high-level goals, very good in principle, as in we want to end poverty, we want to end hunger, world peace, like great ambitions by 2030. But underneath that, there are more than 100 specific indicators. And some of them are so specific that I would argue that companies and investors, less than half of them are actually constructed in a way that we can actually impact them. But it doesn't stop companies from using the SDGs in marketing materials. And that is also because there's no one policing that. So I think to be prudish or just not taking too much risk. I think just think through what frameworks you use when you align yourself with something, because you've got to be able to back it up.
I want to go back to a really important point you made around Scope 3 emissions, because I think that's a bit of a grey area at the moment. It's very difficult and challenging for a lot of companies to find and scope that data. What are you finding from the companies you interact with in terms of their ability to be accurate and report on that Scope 3 information? Yeah,
it's a bit mixed, I would say. Let's say you produce iron ore and you ship that to China. The iron ore then is used in a blast furnace to produce steel. Well, unless that entity that's using your iron ore, or met coal for that matter, unless they produce their emissions, it's very hard then to assess or actually give a truthful estimate to your own Scope 3 emissions. That makes it very hard. I think with increased focus on climate change reporting, not just in Australia but elsewhere, I think over time it'll get easier. But right now I think many companies are struggling with that. And then adding to that then that you need to have assurance, that's tricky. And in our case as investors, we do carbon footprint analysis in our portfolios, which basically means we assess the carbon intensity of our investment portfolios. That's not necessarily equivalent to climate change risk per se. We can talk about that later. But at least we do it just to get a feel for what is the carbon intensity of a portfolio. The Scope 3 emissions, often they're modeled because companies don't disclose them. So then you have different providers providing different types of modeling methodology. And maybe if I go back to one of the other questions you had before about how companies can prepare themselves, if Scope 3 emissions are modeled, well, if the methodology differs between different providers, you've got to pick the one you can motivate as to why you pick that one.
We've spoken a lot about environmental and climate reporting. However, the S in ESG, a lot of those governance professionals who I've spoken to have said that's a bit of a missing piece, apart from perhaps modern slavery. where is the S in ESG, and how does that sit?
Thank you for that question, because I think that's a question I'm very keen to answer, because I think there is misconception about ESG that it's all about the E. I would say the starting point for us is often the governance, or the G in ESG. But in terms of being a practitioner and picking stocks and portfolio construction, I would say the S is actually really, really important. And this comes back to a simple notion that what drives company value? In the old days, the net tangible assets used to make up the majority of a company's value. But over time, something else has increased, and it's it's intangible drivers. So if you think of a market capitalization of a company, and you look at the proportion of that comes from net tangible assets, is decreased over time, which means the market puts a price on something else. I would say included in those factors will be a company's corporate governance, but also a company's culture, its customer relationships, supplier relationships, its human capital development. And as you can tell, a lot of these things I would put an S on. There's a lot of S drivers. So intuitively, as investors, we need to have a handle on how companies are managing these issues. I think we've also seen a number of value destructive events in the market where there's been underpayment of workers, there's been sexual harassment scandals, rogue conduct, which has really destroyed value in the stock market. So if you get an insight into how a company is managing the S, you can make stock recommendations based on that. Whereas the E, I think it's incredibly important, but it's more of a slow burn. There's no surprise that an oil company is an oil company, and they have certain climate change risks. But any company can have a conduct scandal, and when you get those red flags, you can avoid a company. But conversely, if you feel that a company is improving, so let's say you interpret reporting in such a way that I think staff engagement is really improving this company, well, that's potentially a lead indicator for happier customers too. And that could be a lead indicator for market share growth. The mining industry is really interesting in this space because they track safety metrics really closely, and they report that too. We look at them, those stats too, because it's a lead indicator for operational excellence in general. So a company that has major safety issues tend to have operational disruption as well. So that's why the S is so powerful. But it's the most intangible one out of them all. So we do look at company disclosure. We do proprietary ESG research at Ausbil, meaning we don't buy data from anyone else. We look at the company's disclosure. I'm very interested in things like staff engagement surveys. But a staff engagement survey result might have been done 6 months ago before that it gets reported. So by the time it hits the market, it might be obsolete. So we augment that analysis then by looking at sources like Glassdoor. So Glassdoor is a bit like a TripAdvisor, but for staff. You can pick up on trends and what people feel about the culture, etc. So that's really valuable for us, and it's all about piecing a puzzle together. So it's probably the most important one, but it's also the trickiest one because it's ultimately very subjective how you assess a company's culture.
Yeah, really interesting insights there, particularly those examples from mining, I think, around safety is really, really clear. Modern slavery has been a huge focus for the Australian government. In fact, they've just updated some of their regulatory requirements over the past year. Yep. Where does modern slavery kind of sit in terms of the reporting framework for ESG, and has that taken a lot of steam out of the S, or is it a really critical issue? How do you see modern slavery?
I prefer to look at it more from a wider human rights lens. I think there's a danger for companies and investors to look at modern slavery in isolation. So modern slavery is the most extreme form of abuse, essentially. But I remember I went to Bangladesh in 2014 and I visited garment factories. I spoke to unions, workers, NGOs on the ground. And at the time, modern slavery per se wasn't a major issue in the country. Incredibly poor working conditions, but technically not defined necessarily as modern slavery. But it was still a huge brand risk for companies that sourced from there. And then when COVID came, a lot of these workers, they lost out on their income. There's no social network or social welfare network for them. So many of these workers then went to their employers, the factories, and said, hey, can I please have a loan? But the moment you take a loan from your employer, you're a bonded laborer, which is technically modern slavery. So I think it's actually really important to see the whole spectrum of human rights issues, because one could be a lead indicator to the next. In terms of where it's at, I often get asked the question, why do I care about this as an investor? Well, I think it's quite simple. If a company's current earnings rely on underpaid workers or illegal activities like modern slavery, because it is illegal, that's a good starting point. Why would those earnings be sustainable in the long term, particularly when we're facing increased regulation, to your point? Not just here in Australia, but worldwide. We have some countries that have introduced import bans, so you can't import goods made by forced labour. They cannot enter the country. That's one approach. Another approach is to do human rights due diligence on a mandatory basis. That's happening in the EU. Australia's gone down a path of a Transparency Act. I was very involved in the start of that process many years ago. It's called the Modern Slavery Act. But it mandates that companies need to report on the risk of modern slavery in operations and supply chains. But in terms of taking action, I think there's been a lot of focus on reporting in the first few years. Now I think Australia's ready to take the next step, because we're not going to report our way out of this issue. I think it's raised awareness, which is great, but I'd like to see more action, and it's a systemic issue. It's not a company-specific risk. And from an investment perspective, we don't know where the issues might pop up one day, and there's a reputational element there. There's also an earnings sustainability element, as I mentioned before. So we think this is a case where investors can play a role through constructive engagements. I mentioned that trip to Bangladesh. That's not the only one I've been on. I've been to Bangladesh twice. I've been to Cambodia, Thailand, China many times. When you go there and you meet all these people along the whole value chain, you learn about the issues, but you also see what leaders are doing. So responsible sourcing leaders globally. And whatever they do, you can take with you those ideas and encourage companies here to adopt those measures. And that's what we put a lot of emphasis on, that and policy advocacy, because we think we can de-risk our portfolios a bit. Not eliminate risk, but de-risk.
I'm going to be a little bit controversial now and ask you a question that some people have, has been swirling the headlines of late. Is ESG dead? Is it dead, or has it evolved into something else? Because we've heard a lot. There's this whole movement in the US at the moment around a vibe shift following the Trump administration around ESG. But we haven't seen, I guess, the impacts of that materialize in any real sense in Australia. But still, is that question valid, or is it a different question around ESG evolving into something else? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, because there's something I think there's a lot of different answers to it. But in principle, ESG integration and ESG investing really started out around financial materiality. So I mentioned before the whole notion that increasingly the majority of a company's value comes from intangible drivers. So I think we have a vested interest in ensuring we understand how companies manage those risks. But I do think ESG in itself has also evolved over time. So it's gone from just looking at financial and material issues to taking into account a wide range of ESG factors. And if you listen to some proponents, it's almost like companies should take on board every single societal issue there is. And therefore, I'm not surprised about some of the pushback against ESG, against elements of ESG. But I also think the whole notion that ESG is dead is silly, because if you ask a hard-nosed investor who says, I don't care about ESG, that person will most likely care about governance. And the governance is a third of ESG. So that's a starting point. And then, as I mentioned before, to me, it comes back to earnings sustainability, right? So if a business model is based on earnings that rely on fundamentally unsustainable assumptions, whether that's underpriced pollution or illegal activities or weak consumer protection, I don't think that's going to produce earnings that are sustainable over time. So that's how I sit on it. And I for one, think some of the pushback against ESG, I think is justified. But a lot of it, I think, is very ideological in nature. And I don't like them responding in an equally ideological fashion. I think let's look at the facts. So we talked about how value is derived in a company. It's often about intangible things. We have increased regulation coming in. That are two aspects. And I look at our own funds. I'm a co-portfolio manager of a fund where we take ESG into account, and we've managed to outperform index since inception. So I think that speaks for itself. So yeah, ESG is not dead. I think that it's been challenged, and I think it's a good thing to challenge as well. I don't mind that. But the whole notion that ESG as a whole is flawed or is dead, I don't agree with that. And it's not you saying it. I know that people out there in the market saying it. And I think that's very simplified. And I don't think that's true. And then I look at companies. In the last reporting season in August, I spoke to many companies about demand for sustainability. If I speak to property companies, well, they say, well, our tenants are still demanding sustainable buildings. There's strong drivers for that. I spoke to companies about DEI. And I think the simple answer there is a company will not stop investing in ESG as long as it pays off. So if a company feels that by focusing on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is going to drive better staff engagement and productivity, they're not going to stop investing in that. And same thing with safety risk management. There's some real implications if a company has safety incidents. So yeah, in short, I think the corporate world in Australia has not shut down on ESG. I think they'll be more selective. I think companies will focus on the financial and material ones. So we've kind of done a full circle and we're back where we started, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing.
The Australian government has opened the door to its standards sustainability reporting to incorporate other sustainability frameworks. And one of them that's come up in popularity or has gained increasing attention is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the TNFD framework, which looks at biodiversity a little bit more acutely. Do you see interests or momentum being gained around TNFD disclosure, or do you see it as being something that companies are needing to catch up or looking at it from a bit of a distance?
Yeah, look, the starting point, of course, is that biodiversity is an existential threat to all of us. But there's a number of points I want to make on this topic because it's a very multifaceted and complex topic. The first one, I think, is that as investors, we need to understand the risks, of course. It comes back to dependency on nature, where can things go wrong, and it's ultimately linked to climate change too. But we're also interested in finding companies that are providing a solution, because that's the companies we want to invest in, right? We might want to avoid certain companies, but a lot of these things are also going to play out over a very long time. Second point I would like to make is that it's fair that the government is asking companies to do more, but the government sets the rules, right? So the government needs to play its part here, because to expect companies to do more than what they need to do legally, I'm not sure if that's reasonable. Companies are trying to make money and they're using natural resources, so we need to have a strong regulation on how to use natural resources. The third point I'd like to make is that I'm not sure that a reporting framework will solve the issue. Sometimes I feel like ESG reporting has almost become an industry in its own right. We spend a lot of time on that. And as an investor, when I speak to a company, yes, I need to know that they understand the issues, but also I want them to spend the time on managing those issues, because that's managing risk in our portfolios, as opposed to spending all that time reporting. And if I was on the corporate side, I might push back a few times and say, yes, we can provide you this information, but only if you promise to use it in your investment process and make investment decisions on it, because otherwise, why we're doing it. So TNFD, I think a lot of companies are in the starting block on that one. It's very complex. I think just because TCFD has been successful, I think it's dangerous to extrapolate that success and say that TNFD will be easy, because it's very granular. I think TNFD will develop over time. I'm not sure it's completely investor friendly at this point. But over time, I think it'll be, hopefully we can see changes that make it a bit more useful for investors too. The other thing I'm always interested in is, before I ask a company to do something reporting wise, I also need to ask myself, would I be able to report myself? That I think investors owe that to companies before we pile on demands on them.
Yeah, and I've noticed with a lot of governance professionals that the layering of different compliance and reporting has really taken a lot of time and efforts away from strategy discussions around compliance and reporting, and that's really having a bit of a threat to the way organisations navigate their challenges moving forward.
Correct, because you could argue that by having a reporting framework, it forces companies to acknowledge the risks, and then what's being reported needs to be managed. But I also think companies are not drowning in, but they're certainly struggle, particularly small companies, with reporting demands. And I think we need to be a bit more streamlined and say, this is really important for us investors. We need this information to make investment decisions, but maybe cut out some of the fluff, because otherwise we're actually doing a disfavour to the companies.
We will wrap up there, but thank you again, and we look forward to having you hopefully again on another episode to unpack further issues around sustainability. But thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Cheers.